All right, let's do this. We have a lot to get through today, so let's go. Let's do this. Today is deployment and reverse proxy servers. Deployment and reverse proxy servers, and I'm doing this all through live demos. So what I want to do is do a live demo of basically everything you have to do for homework 4 and everything you need for project part 4 objective 1. Everything we need to know about deployment. And I'm going to use Nginx to do that. So let me just dive into some demos and hope things don't go terribly, terribly wrong, as they can do sometimes. So let's start with the homework, and I might bounce back and forth between them just a little bit here because there's some topics that overlap quite a bit. We're going to use some of the same ideas here. The first thing I want to do, oops, I don't want that open. Let me close all of this stuff. So I'll have to cheat a little bit. I ain't going to lie. I'll have to cheat a little bit. So I have my Nginx backup directory. That's like the full solution. So I might have to refer to that a few times because I don't remember the names of every constant, and I'll do a little bit of cheating. But what we want to do is add Nginx to our server. Nginx is a very powerful tool that does lots and lots and lots of things. What we're going to use it for, in our context, we're going to use it as a reverse proxy. So a proxy is something, if I want to, which you've heard this word before in at least some context, but a proxy in the terms of the internet is if I want to send a message to some server, I'm going to send it to my proxy server first, and then the proxy server is going to send it on my behalf. At a very bare bones implementation, this is what a VPN is. VPN should be adding a lot more extra security and extra stuff on top of that. But a VPN at its core is a proxy server. You send a message to your VPN. VPN sends a message to the server you want to connect to on your behalf. They get the response and then send the response back to you. A reverse proxy is the similar idea except on the server side. So on our server side, instead of having clients connect to our server directly, we're going to ask clients, or not ask them, they have to. We're going to tell clients to connect to our proxy server. The proxy server is going to talk to the client for us, and then the proxy server takes their requests, sends them to our server. We send our responses to the proxy server. Proxy server sends the responses back to the client. So what we'll have is effectively 2 web servers that both speak HTTP, and Nginx is going to be our proxy server, which kind of talks to the outside world for us. So before anything leaves our server, our physical infrastructure, it's going to go through our reverse proxy server of Nginx. And again, Nginx has all kinds of neat features. It's made to scale, and it's a good load balancer if you have multiple servers. Nginx can be your one entry point from the outside world, and then Nginx can distribute the workload among other servers. If you have a full server room filled with this big distributed app, put Nginx in front of that. Nginx talks to the outside world and then distributes the messages. You might even have another layer where a different load balancer is balancing between multiple instances of Nginx, and then Nginx distributes it further. You can do all kinds of fun stuff with this stuff. But we're going to configure Nginx to be a reverse proxy server. For that, we're going to specify, I think I got the very first word wrong right here, server. I'm going to create a server and use this specific Nginx configuration file syntax. I'm going to create a server that's going to listen, and at this point, we're actually going to the actual ports for HTTP and eventually HTTPS. I'm going to listen on port 80. So we're about to be kind of done with port 8080 and port 8000. If you use that at all, I don't think I've been using it in lecture. I don't think I did that in anything I gave to y'all this semester. But we're going to listen on port 80. This is the default port for HTTP. If you say http://localhost and then no port at all, you're going to get a request on port 80. So with Nginx being our entry point from the outside world to our server, we're going to listen on the actual default ports that everybody's expecting us to be listening on if we're calling ourselves a web server. So I'm listening on port 80, and I want to specify extra directions based on the request that I get. So I'm going to say if I get a request for a path that starts with /, which will be every single path ever. So if I get anything sent to me, I'm going to, and this is where I'm going to forget the names of the variables. I think it's proxy pass. I'm going to get a request, and I'm going to pass it should I use 8080? I'll use 8080. I'm going to pass it to my server that's running on the same machine as my Nginx instance in this case, in this example. So I'm going to pass that message, any messages I get over port 80, and send it to my app with some host name. What's the host name going to be for my app? This is a bit of a loaded question, I suppose. But what's the host name going to be for my app? Will we go over DOS stuff at some point? Yeah, baby. Yeah, we will. It's on the schedule. I think it's the Wednesday after break. What's up? Did you have an answer? I thought I... Wherever we're deployed. Not quite. So what eventually we're going to do is deploy at a domain name, and Nginx is going to be listening at that domain name. Actually, I should have that. I think host. I'll cheat and look at my solutions to fix all the variable names when we get there. For our purposes now, this will be localhost. Someone was saying something? Yep.
Would it be like the window thing we did?
Oh, I like that answer so much. I wish it was the right answer, but but I like that answer so much because I made a big deal. Like, make sure this is dynamic. Your host name shouldn't be hard coded. I like that answer. Since we're not in JavaScript, this won't be ran inside any browser. We won't have access to that information. So I say this is a loaded question because I haven't given a whole lot of context as to how we're going to use Nginx yet. And we're going to use Nginx in a Docker container. I want another Docker container. We're going to add a third one to our configuration for Nginx. And we're going to do things a little bit different than we have before. I'm going to actually create a Docker file for Nginx. Unlike what we did with Mongo, I'm actually going to have some configuration that I'll need for my Nginx. Mainly, I need to get this configuration file into that container so my instance of Nginx can use this configuration and access it. So from Nginx, and we'll leave this as a to-do. Can I put to-dos? There we go. To-do. So we'll have some Docker file that's going to be responsible for creating our Nginx instance. From Nginx, that's fine. Kind of like what we have for Mongo. This is like a one-line Docker file that says from Mongo 425. But we're not using an image here. We're using build. And we're going to specify the path to a Docker file. And this is exactly why I have one reason why I have my Nginx configuration in a separate directory, because I'm going to specify that directory here. I'm going to say Nginx. That should be all I need there. And that's going to look in that directory for a Docker file and then build this container based on that Docker file. So if I run Docker, which I do have running, terminal. Oh, come on. I'm going to get 3 containers running. It's not really going to work the way I want it to right now, but we'll at least see what Nginx is going to do. But mostly I just want Docker running right now because I don't feel like waiting later for that to run. And then in this configuration file, I need to do, right now just one thing. Eventually 3 things we want to do right here. But what I want to do is copy. Now, before in our Docker file, we just did copy ... and that copied everything in the working directory to everything in the working directory inside the container, which is kind of a sledgehammer approach to things. It works great for us for a lot of purposes, but we want to be a lot more careful right now. We want to move this configuration file into a directory where Nginx is going to be expecting a configuration file. So I want to copy default conf from outside the container, from in this directory, it'll look in the directory, to etc/nginx/ oops, spelled correctly, nginx/conf.d/default.conf. That one I remember. For some reason, that one always sticks. But this, actually, I know why that sticks. But that's the directory where Nginx is going to be looking for configuration files. So I have to copy this file into that directory, that very specific directory, and then I can name it whatever I want, as long as it ends in .conf. But I have to get it in that directory, because that's where Nginx is going to say, okay, let me look in this directory to see if I have any configuration files. And if it does, it's going to use it. If it doesn't, it just doesn't use any config. Yep.
I guess, why aren't you going to the parent directory first? Is it just Nginx, etc., Nginx.d, or is that slash from the parent of the home directory of the Docker?
This is in the Docker container. This leading slash is very important, though. And this is this is an absolute path. And this is I still want to answer it because this is it tripped me up for a while to understand what this means. If you're getting used to navigating directory structures, with or without that leading slash are two extremely different things. If I delete this leading slash, everything's going to break, nothing works, and I'm pulling my hair out trying to debug this thing. With the leading slash, everything works great. I mean, assuming I got everything else right. I might have something typed wrong here. Then everything does work. This is an absolute path. If leading slash means go to the root directory of the file system, and then I'm specifying where from the root directory of the file system, so all the way up at the very, very top of your file system. For you Windows users, that would be the C drive, usually. But this is the top level directory, and then specify the absolute path from there. If I don't have the leading slash, it's going to start from my working directory, which the way I set up my Docker files, I guess I didn't do this one, but it's going to be the home directory of the user, which I usually set to be /root. So it'll be at /root/etc, which is a directory which won't exist in this particular case, and nothing's going to work the way I want it to. So that leading slash, very, 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 very important. It's one of them things that when you're first getting used to this stuff, the mistake I made, not picking on anyone here, I've went through the same path, is when you're just copying things from documentation or from tutorials, and one time when you cut and paste, you just don't grab that leading slash, and then everything works. You're like, I copied and pasted it exactly as it was. No, you missed one character, and it's a very important character. That leading slash, very important. All right, so we have Docker running. Let's go to our browser and see what we get. If I go to localhost, I'm not going to go to localhost 8000. Actually, I will go to 8080. So here's my app running. And if I go to localhost with no port, I'm going to get, well, nothing. That's cute. I know what I did wrong, though, at least. I get nothing. Did you expect us to get nothing? We should have got nothing. So Nginx is listening on port 80. Anybody want to shout out my mistake? I feel bad for this one. Anybody know, getting familiar enough with Docker to call this one out? Let me scroll down a little bit. It'll help. I didn't specify any port. So Docker, inside the Docker container, Nginx, I told to listen on port 80 for HTTP connections, but I have no way from outside the container to get those messages in. So I'm going to get my ports here, and I want to map port. And I actually want to change something real quick here, just because I know it'll cause too many questions. I'm just going to change mine to 8080 instead of 8000. So now I'm mapping local port 80 to 80 inside the Nginx container. Because otherwise, if I don't have this, you might think, why doesn't it just do that automatically? Well, at this point, I think it's more clear to see. I have 3 Docker containers running. If I get a request on port 80, even if I expect something to happen automatically, which container would that be forwarded to? And keeping in mind that all 3 of these containers might have a TCP server running, listening for connections on port 80, which one's Docker supposed to choose? What one do you expect it to choose? You have to tell it. It's not going to guess. So we're specifying 8080. That'll get to inside this container, 880. I'm telling my Nginx to listen on port 80, so that should be getting to my Nginx instance. I'm going to cheat because I'm not going to have time to make too many mistakes here. Listen 80 server name and proxy pass. Hey, I got proxy pass, right? Proxy pass and proxy pass. Oh, proxy HTTP version. I'm going to grab these other 2 headers too because I don't feel like thinking of them. These 3 headers I put in every Nginx configuration, and I think I've only typed them once, and then I copy and paste them every other time. But proxy HTTP version, which version of HTTP are we using? We've been using 1.1 all semester, so let's specify that. And then these 2 headers. Certain headers will not be forwarded by Nginx. Nginx won't always take a header and send it to our server when it's acting as a reverse proxy. So we have to specify those such headers and say, hey, forward these headers. I want these headers. Upgrade and connection are 2 headers that won't automatically be forwarded. So if you have Nginx sitting in front of your app as a reverse proxy and you would like to use WebSockets, you have to have these 2 lines right here, or else your WebSockets will not work because your server running in its own container will never get a request. It'll get the upgrade request, but it won't get that request with these 2 headers, which, if you ask me, is kind of frustrating. I'm sure there's a good reason why it behaves like that, but I don't know what it is. Now we should get Nginx and Nginx. Oh, come on. Well, let's get it now that we have the fixed Docker file. It's fine. Takes a while to build each time. But while we're waiting for that one, now that we have some more context, this is less of a trap question. What do we put here? What's our host name for our app? Oh my goodness, yes. There we go. It's whatever you named your service here. This is the same thing as when we connected to our Mongo container from our app. It's the same exact thing. The host name is going to be whatever we named the service in our Docker Compose file, which I named my cool app right here. Because when I had it named app, then everybody thinks that's a magical word. I had to name it something strange that made the point that it's whatever I named it here. I named it something silly. That's what's going to go in my configuration here, is that silly thing. So it has to be whatever you named your app service in your Docker Compose file, because Docker Compose, whenever it passes messages between containers, that's what it uses as the host name for the network that it created, is the name of that service. Now we should get an error, but a different error. We did, to be fair, because I had that as underscores. I was hoping to see my hello from Nginx message there. So let's run this again and actually see our app in action. Well, that's happening. Let's set up the next step. Kind of have to parallelize this a little bit. Go to my slides and grab this thing, because we don't want HTTP. Having that reverse proxy the way we're setting it up right now, kind of pointless. Not entirely, but kind of pointless. The reason why we're setting up Nginx like this is to get our HTTPS going. We want to get a self-signed cert And what we're going to do is install it into our Nginx container. Now we can set it up in our code. I can do this thing right here. Grab the actual socket connection that socket server is using, threading socket server at this point, and slap some TLS on top of that connection. Say use this cert and this key, and start using some TLS right here. We can do this in code. Generally, it's kind of, I don't know, I think it's just kind of gross to have that in our code itself. I would rather have it modularized, have it somewhere else. So what we're going to do is put that in our Nginx configuration. Nginx is going to speak HTTPS. Remember, Nginx is going to be our gateway to the outside world. Anyone who wants to talk to our server needs to go through Nginx. And Nginx, every time something's going to leave our server, it's got to go through Nginx first. So Nginx is our gateway to the outside world. If everything that leaves Nginx or gets to Nginx is encrypted, we're encrypted to the outside world. Nothing unencrypted is hitting the internet at large. It's all internal to our network. And if we're a small organization, it's going to be internal to one device. And even for a larger network, it might be internal to one server room or one server farm. It's going to be located on premise. It's not going to be leaving our premises unencrypted, much less hitting the internet at large. So that's what we want. That's a good property. Did I close? Oh, here it is. This one I expect the site to show up. So now on port 80, we do have the reverse proxy set up. I sent a request on port 80. It's hard to see, but I just have localhost with no :8080. It's just localhost, so it's going to be the default port of 80, which we should be able to see in the console. Click on the elephant. Port 80. So we're using port 80 here, the default port for HTTP. So we got the reverse proxy set up. That's what we need to set up the reverse proxy. But we want to go further than that. We need some encryption. So now Nginx speaks HTTPS. Nginx is going to strip away all the encryption and send an HTTP request to our server. So our server's code doesn't have to change at all. It just speaks HTTP, and we're happy with that. We're not updating our code and putting network level logic inside of our application. We want application logic in our application, network configuration elsewhere, and in our case, Nginx. So let's set this up. What we want to do is change this to 443. 443 is the default port for HTTPS. I'm going to go to my command line. I'm going to go into my directory with my Nginx configuration, and I'm pasting that command from the slides. You just have to paste that. I gave you the whole answer with that one because there's no reason to make you go through figuring out how that command works. And here we're going to get all those questions. A lot of these questions are optional except country code. For some reason, this one is required. I'm sure there's a good reason. I don't know it off the top of my head. I'm going to put US, and then the rest of the questions, I'm just going to hit enter and skip them all. It's fewer questions than I thought it was. So I was in that directory. I ran my command. If I go up here and refresh this thing, I see I got two files here, cert.pem. This is my certificate. That's what I specified in that command. I said, somewhere in here. Oh my goodness, I'm blind. Right here. I specified call my certificate file, cert.pem, and call my private key file, private.key. So I got cert.pem in my private key, which I'm going to not keep private. If anybody wants to compromise this sample app that isn't going to be deployed anywhere, there's my private key. This is what you keep private. You can see how much entropy there is. Nobody's ever guessing your private key by pure chance. There's way too much entropy there. They'll never do it. And this is the certificate that includes my public key. That's what I share with everybody. And this is self-signed, so it shouldn't be trusted. Now I want to go to my configuration. You know, I had confidence earlier today that I was going to remember this. SSL, TLS, and I'm not going to. SSL certificate key. SSL certificate, SSL certificate key. So the SSL certificate is my cert, and then the key is going to be my private key. What I want to specify is the path to the files. So I'll do an absolute path again, and you can pick any path you want for these ones. And we're going to see why in a second. I'm going to specify the path of where I want to tell Nginx to look, as opposed to configuration files where I have to put it in a directory where Nginx is already looking. Here I'm telling Nginx where to look to find these files. So I'm going to use my root directory, my home directory called root, which is the root directory /root, but maybe that's a little odd naming. And then cert.pem, and then /root. So I'm choosing whatever I want. This is just where I decided to put these things. Root / private.key. And are those files going to be there? No. SSL. I knew I was forgetting something. I had to say encrypt on this connection. So those files aren't going to be there, but I'm going to put them there in my Docker file. So that's the rest of what we need to do here. And I'm realizing, actually, I don't need to. I'm going to copy cert.pem into /root. I think this creates the directory if it doesn't exist. So I'm going to skip my setting the home directory and current working directory because I got a lot of other stuff to do. Cert.pem and copy private.key to /root private.key. So I'm putting these files in very specific places and then telling Nginx to look in those specific places. And look, this wouldn't compile. I don't have my semicolons. And telling Nginx to look in those specific places. That location does not matter as long as you're consistent. As long as the Docker file and the configuration file are in sync, the Docker file is putting the files in the same place that you're telling Nginx through the configuration file to look for them, you're going to be fine with that one. But it's got to be consistent. And unless I mess something up, that's it. Oh, I did mess something up. I got a map 443 now. I don't have to expose. I did that in my other one, but that's not something we have to do. This is all fine. Yeah, I got everything. Okay, we'll let that run. I want to talk about, can I get this big enough? Go this big. I want to start shifting gears into how to deploy out there to the world. So I can't just jump into this. I got to talk about some background. So what I'm using here is a DigitalOcean droplet. So I have a few droplets. I'm using this one right now, 159.9, whatever it is. This is the one that's running 116.com, 312.com, and a few other things. I'm going to borrow this one and use this as my server where I'm going to deploy. And this is usually more fun, but Google's been frustrating me lately, so we won't get a new domain name today. I know it's sad. But what you'll do on the app, ideally using your GitHub educational pack. Is that what it's called? I forget. But I'm blanking on it right now. But using that, you get one free domain name, I think from Namecheap still. So you would get your Namecheap domain name. You get free DigitalOcean droplet time. You get that DigitalOcean droplet. And if you want to do a different thing, do a different thing. But this is the recommended path because it's free, is use the DigitalOcean droplet. DigitalOcean droplet is going to give you your own machine, a virtual machine, of course, but it's going to give you your own machine with a fixed IP address, and you have free reign over that machine. You can do whatever you want. This is one reason I like DigitalOcean, is it just gives you a machine and you do anything. You have root access, you have SSH access, you do whatever you want with this. But you only have an IP address. So when you get your domain name, you'll get your domain name, and here, Google's frustrating me. They used to do their domain service and they sold it to Squarespace, and they're like, you're a Squarespace customer now, whether you want to or not. And now I try to go to Squarespace and I can't see my domain. It's frustrating. I liked Google's interface. They do things well, but they just don't want me to be a customer of theirs. And I think I'm Uncreative is the one I want to, it's about to expire, not about to, but in a few months. I'm Uncreative. And when you get a domain name, you want to set up the DNS records. Having a domain name and having an IP address, that's cool, but we got to smash those things together. We do that through a DNS-A record. So when you get your domain name, the interface, of course, will be different no matter what service you're using, but you'll set up the A record and put your IP address in. And that's it. Don't put anything for host name. And that's going to update all the DNS servers and say, hey, look, if anybody sends a request to imuncreative.com, forward that request to this IP address. So now my IP address is going to get any request for that domain name, and I effectively control this domain name, and I have a server where I'm forwarding traffic to. Anything from this domain name, send it to this IP address. And with DigitalOcean, I SSH to that IP address. Now I had to set up SSH keys and everything. That's why I didn't have to type in any password. There's a little bit of setup. You have to get your root password, log in with your root password, and then if you want to set up your SSH keys, you can do that. I like to because I'm not typing in that password every single time. But if you're only going to use it for this course and not use it after that, it's not that big of a pain to type in that password a few times. But I'm going to SSH into it, and now I'm in my machine that's somewhere in New York City, which is almost certainly probably a Docker container, and I can do whatever I want. So there's two big things that you want to do when you get to this point. One, install Docker, and two, clone your repo and run Docker Compose up. If everything's all set up, that's almost what you have to do, but you still want to set up some Nginx configuration. Now, I actually have multiple, at least for the example we'll do. I won't do that whole thing. But I'll actually have multiple layers of Nginx if I set up the whole thing, which is kind of janky. But what I have on this site is a whole bunch of Docker containers running, all running on different ports. It's kind of awkward to see when it's that big and I can't get one line per thing. Let's do it. But what I have is different Docker containers running on different local port numbers. A lot of them are using 5,000 internally because they're all flash gas. Most of them are. But they're different local ports mapping to the internal port inside the container. So I have all these apps running on different port numbers locally. And then, I'll say the punchline, and then we'll see it in action in a little bit. And then I have Docker. There's too many things. Nginx. Then I have an Nginx instance that's saying, if I get a request for this domain name, send it to this port. This domain name, send it to this port. And I'll show you how that works in a second. But we should have our Docker Compose up and running now. So let's finish up this example. This is the end of the homework example. That was the start of the project example, just in case that part's not clear. So if I go to my app, localhost, I'm not surprised we broke that, but https://localhost. Yeah, because I didn't put listen 80 on there. Oh, come on, do it for me. Okay, and we get a warning. Not an error. This should work, but this is what we're going to see because I have a self-signed cert. Since I have a self-signed cert, my browser is going to say, yo, you shouldn't be trusting this. Like, this is something's wrong with this cert. The cert's invalid. If I look up here, it says not secure. This is a self-signed cert, certificate not valid, all kinds of warnings all over the place that this is not a good cert. This is a self-signed cert. The browser should not trust this because it doesn't map back to a root CA. It cannot be verified. This is what we have to have for localhost because nobody's going to sign a cert for localhost. Doesn't make sense. So I'm going to be naive and be like, help me understand. And then there's this little option here that says proceed. With parentheses, it says this is unsafe. So we can still go to the site, but the browser is going to have all kinds of warnings. You don't want your users going through all those warnings. You don't want customer support getting called and customer support. Oh yeah, oh no, just click that it's fine. Yeah, it's fine, it's fine. No, you're not going to deploy an app like that. So self-signed certs, not in practice. For educational purposes, for development purposes, fine. And then when we go to the network, HTTPS, we are encrypted on port 443. We do have actual encryption going on now, and everything's not working as expected because my WebSockets will be broken. To fix our WebSockets, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I got to at least mention this. To fix WebSockets, we have this connection string to connect to our WebSockets that uses the WebSocket protocol, WS. If you want to use WebSockets with encryption, now I'm encrypted. And now my WebSockets would work if I rebuilt Docker, but I'm not going to wait for Docker again. And I can see my app running here. This one. Yeah. Why is it saying 8,000 still? Anyway. Am I mapping to localhost 8,000 in this config? Maybe I am. But one thing I think I might have shown briefly once, but something I really haven't shown much this semester, is you can enter into a Docker container. This is just to show what I was talking about earlier. I want to do this. If you do docker exec-it, the ID for that container, which I grabbed by doing docker ps, it lists all of your Docker containers, and then bash or bin bash, but bash just works these days. I'm going to enter into my container, and now I have a command line inside the container. This can be useful for a few things. One, if you want to see if your images are being saved properly, or if you want to bounce into your database. I think that's what I did earlier this semester. If you want to bounce into your database and see what's going on in your database in your container, that's only useful if you have bugs that are not present when you run with Python, but are present when you run with Docker. Sometimes you want to do that stuff. But here, just to show you what's going on inside Docker, if I look at my present working directory, I went into the wrong container anyway because I'm an idiot. I wanted to go into, but those are all the project files, all the project stuff's there. I wanted to go into the Nginx container. So I'm going to get that ID. And take a look at what's happening here. So the root directory is actually the root directory. The home directory is the root directory. I thought it would have been by default, the other one. But I'm going to go into the directory named root. Oh, this is my home directory. It's just not the working directory. And in the directory named root, I have my cert.pem and my private key. So those did get copied into the location that I expected. And I can go to etc root, etc nginx. Are you sure? It's because I put ECT instead of ETC. Nginx, and take a look at my Nginx directory. I have my conf.d directory that has my default conf, so my file got into the right directory. That's where I wanted it. And I also have this, oh, it doesn't exist. I also have this nginx.conf. If I look at this configuration file, this is the configuration file for Nginx. And we can see one major thing here. This configuration file says also include any configuration files that are in this directory, and the file name has to end in .conf. That's exactly the directory we put our configuration in, and we made sure it ended in .conf. So that file also got used as part of the configuration. But this is the actual top-level configuration file for Nginx. Okay, so that is most of what we want to see on the homework. I'm going to cheat a little. More. Did I not? Oh, I really didn't do it here. I'm going to cheat a little more because I don't remember the syntax and I don't have it in my other thing. But here I am back on in my container, in my DigitalOcean droplet, where we're going to deploy the app. So this is back to project land. We have one last thing to do on the homework, unless I forgot to put it in the homework testing procedures. I think I got it in there, though. Redirecting HTTP to HTTPS. I'm going to cd into that same directory that we were just in the container on localhost, etc nginx, and I can see the same stuff, except if I cat the configuration file, there's a second directory that's included, which I thought this was just default. I was surprised to not see it inside that other container. But this other directory that's included, this sites enabled, any file in there is going to be added on to our configuration. So let's go into sites enabled. And I can see the way I like to have it is having one configuration file for each site. It's the way Nginx is expecting it to, so I'm just happily complying with that structure. I like it. And I have all my configuration files here. And I do have one for imuncreative.com, so let's just go into that one. And y'all can tell Ethan to be mad at me for using Pico. I'm fine with that. I have this configuration file for imuncreative.com. Oh, this doesn't work without doing it all live. Well, we're on a time crunch anyway, so let me do this. So the way I would set up this configuration file is I would have the only thing that I really did was this. This is the way I would set up my configuration file. That's going to listen for HTTP on port 80 and forward requests to the port that I specify. So I have all my Docker containers running with different local ports. And then I have my Nginx configuration, which in this case isn't running in a container. I have my Nginx running on the machine itself. And Nginx is going to listen for requests. If I get a request for imuncreative.com, it's going to forward that request to localhost port 8365. Since I'm not inside containers, I'm not in a Docker composed network, I'm not using the service name here. So it's a little bit different setup than you might have. You can do the same setup for your project deployment, by the way, or not. You don't need, let me back up. You don't need this setup if you're not running multiple domain names on the same server. That's why I'm doing it like this, so I can route traffic for different domain names to different services. But this is all I set up. I'll try saving these changes. I don't know if this one's going to work for me, but I'm going to save those changes. Then I'll do Certbot. So we haven't done anything related to signed certificates yet. So, man, we don't have much time. This is going to be crunch. Certbot. This is something that needs to be installed. I'm going to say I'm running Nginx on Ubuntu. It's going to tell me how to install Certbot. A few steps to do it. And then Certbot -Nginx. I already have it installed. -Nginx. It's going to say, well, we looked at your Nginx configuration. Looks like you got a bunch of domain names here. Which one are you working with? And I'm working with imuncreative.com. So I'm going to choose 6. And it's going to ask me, it's going to say, yeah, this is what I was afraid of. It's saying you already have a cert. Why are you doing this? I'm going to do renew and replace. Sure. And what it's doing right now is verifying that I actually control imuncreative.com. Because all I did was have an Nginx file. I could type any domain name there. I could type buffalo.edu and it'd be fine. But here it's actually verifying that I do control that domain name. And now it said everything went fine. And it's going to ask me, do you want to redirect or not redirect HTTP requests? I would like to redirect them, please. And then if I go into my configuration file, Certbot added all of this stuff for me. It did my redirects. So if I get a request for port 80, it's going to redirect it. And this, I won't have time to go back to it, but this is the last piece of your homework, is how to redirect. If I get something on port 80, redirect it to HTTPS, same host name, same URI. Same everything, but on HTTPS, port 443 instead of 80. And then when I get a request on port 443, I have all that configuration we set up, plus a little extra for Certbot that we did manually on the homework. Certbot just went in and did that all. It generated my cert, my private key, it signed the public key, gave me a cert, changed my configuration, did all of this for me. So getting your signed cert, and by the way, for free. Getting your signed cert on your deployment, as long as you control the domain name, super easy. If I go here, there should be something there. I don't remember what's running on that port. Oh, don't kill me right at the end. There we go.